Another worry Bookchin expresses concerns the high valuation of de-individuation. That is, that deep ecology seems to be saying at various points that our being selves or individuals or having an individualistic mindset is a problem and is part of what leads to the environmental problems that we face. And Bookchin just notes that this kind of recommendation to de-individualize is problematically similar to the kinds of forces at work in like mass media and advertising, which are kind of pushing people to agree with what a larger group believe rather than to think for themselves. And that, of course, that pushing people to agree with what a larger group believes, that's something that is very useful for advertisers because they want to sell more of a particular product, for instance, or for political parties because they want to get more adherents to their particular camp or team when it comes to voting, or for fascist regimes. I mean, if you think about the way that propaganda worked in Nazi Germany and in other places, these are all similar kinds of mechanisms. They encourage the individual not to think for themselves, but to join up with the collective and just kind of get their beliefs through a kind of osmosis from the collective, just through feeling or through kind of being linked up in a less reflective and conscious way, or less sort of reflective and critical way that would individualize them. Not be so individualized and critical and self-distancing, but rather just join the mass and whatever the mass believes. And so Bookchin is just expressing a worry about when deep ecologists talk about sort of becoming one with nature or humans becoming de-individualized, that it looks like that kind of evaporation of the self. That's so problematic. And rather than that, Bookchin recommends that we instead become more full and authentic selves. That is, that yes, he wants us to be able to join collective projects, but we should join collective projects because we've thought carefully about what our options are and what's the right thing to do. And we should join those collective projects being willing to argue with others and kind of make our case for what we think the group should do. And that's how groups come to be maximally ethically responsive to the problems that they try to address, is they have individuals, each of whom or most of whom are critical and reflective and give their opinions. And so Bookchin thinks we need to it's not that we need to become non-selves, we need to become better selves. We need to get in touch with our higher selves, become the best selves that we can be. And then that will lead to better selves and also better societies. Another problem with deep ecology is that it simplifies nature. I mean, I already mentioned this a little bit, but when you look at the effects of point number 4 and point number 7, one of the big effects of that is that it tends to treat nature as this kind of homogeneous, spiritually accessed thing, rather than as the kind of complex, multifaceted, sometimes difficult to understand thing that the sciences tell us that it is. And Bookchin thinks it's much better to have a kind of scientific approach to what nature is, to recognize the complexity and the many different dimensions of nature, rather than treat it as just a single thing because that fits our, let's say, our kind of spiritual biases about what we want nature to be. He thinks that it's better to recognize the complexity of nature, and that, in fact, ecology, one of the great things about the ecology movement, he says, is that they've rested on ecological science for much of what they say, which means that they're able to notice, to see things about the complexity of nature, and to guide us effectively in terms of how we relate ourselves to nature. And if we give up all of that kind of scientific backing, that scientific basis of ecology, if we sort of pull back from the detailed study of the complexities of nature and appreciation of the complexities of nature, and pull back to a kind of spiritualist pro-nature stance like the deep ecologists seem to do, then we lose all of the sophistication, complexity, nuance of the scientific analyses of nature, and it becomes much harder for us to guide ourselves in terms of what our relationship to nature is, and to be able to do that, to do that effectively, and to do that in the direction of what really would be best for ourselves and other living things. The last point that Bookchin makes is that the deep ecologist's position on population control or population reduction is, as he calls it, reactionary. And what he means by that term reactionary is that they've based their opinions or their judgments, their commitments about population reduction on beliefs that have been shown to be false. So remember that the deep ecologists had said that a significant reduction in human population was necessary in order for ecological problems to be addressed. They said that in their 1985 Statement of Principles. It's also noteworthy in the 1973 Statement of Principles from R.N.A. Ness, he didn't make that commitment. He didn't say anything about population control, but in the 1985 principles, the authors do advocate population control or population reduction. And so Bookchin's criticism of what they say about population control and population reduction is that they're imagining that that population control should happen by something like starvation or by disease, and that would be a good result or a good way, at least an effective way, for human populations to be reduced. But there is actually not much evidence in favor of that. In fact, there's a strong tradition of social research that suggests that the more affluent a country is, the more affluent a population is, the fewer children they have, or in other words, the tendency towards overpopulation reduces as affluence increases. And the reason for that is that people have more options for things in their life that give them satisfaction. And when they have more options, then they tend to choose options other than having children to give satisfaction in their life. Whereas when people have few options because they're very poor, or they don't have access to contraception, or women don't have options and control over their lives and how many children they have, for instance, because they say don't have any ability to get contraception or to say no to their husbands, then population tends to increase, and so the best solution, according to that literature, to quote unquote overpopulation is to increase affluence, to reduce rates of extreme poverty and disease, and to improve the conditions of people's lives and improve access to education and choices for women, and improve access to contraception worldwide. That all those things would do more towards reducing human population, high rates of increased population, than these other proposals. It's also noteworthy that Bookchin argues that food scarcity is more of a social than a natural problem. It's not. Again, there's a strong tradition of research that shows that the problem in food supply, the reason why some people worldwide don't have enough food to eat, is not that there isn't enough food to go around, or that enough food couldn't be produced to go around because the environment can't sustain it. There's very little evidence of that. In fact, the evidence is that the reason that there isn't enough food in some places is because of the networks for moving food from one place to another, or other kinds of institutional factors that keep some people poor and impoverished, and poor and famished, that is, poor and with not enough food to eat, and keep others with far more food than they need to survive. So again, it's actually a nice test case for Bookchin's main thesis, which is that the problems we face are primarily caused by something in our social organization. They're not universal problems of the relation between humans and nature. They're not problems that exist in a historical and social vacuum or always appear in exactly this form or would appear in this form in any social and historical situation. But they appear in our social and historical situation because of features of our history and society. And that if we want to fix them, we need to fix them at a social level. Now, I've said a lot about what Bookchin says in criticism of deep ecology. I want now just briefly to mention two maybe lines of criticism that one could offer towards Bookchin. I'm sure there are many more than just these, but one is revealed by a comment by George Sessions, one of the authors of the 1985 Deep Ecology book, when he was asked about the choice between deep ecology and social ecology. What's the difference? And this is reported in Bookchin's article. He said that it's the choice between spirituality and Marxism. So Bookchin says that's not fair, that's not true, probably because Bookchin affiliates more as an anarchist than as a communist. He doesn't, Bookchin isn't, based on, what he said here, he doesn't seem to be a big fan of a kind of Leninist or Stalinist or Maoist political philosophy. He's not a Marxist in the kind of classical state-centered power Marxist sense, but I'm sure he would say that there are many arguments that Marx made that are convincing and that are good, that are good observations and arguments. But he's not a Leninist or a Maoist or Stalinist. He's much more of an anarchist. He repeatedly appeals to this thinker Kropotkin, who was a famous anarchist theorist. And anarchists are very suspicious of any kind of power differential in society. They want to they take it as an ideal to dismantle or to reduce the influence of any kind of power hierarchy in society, including the power hierarchy between state governments and individual members of the society. So that's why they would be opposed to things like Stalinism and Leninism. But so from Bookchin's perspective, calling social ecology Marxism is offensive and not correct. But even if you put the choice as between spirituality and anarchism, it's arguable that there's something in this kind of it's clearly a kind of atheistic or non-spiritualist political program that has mostly to do that is Bookchin's social ecology, that has mostly to do with addressing social problems. And so I think when Sessions says that deep ecology is a matter of spirituality rather than some kind of progressive social movement like Marxism, socialism, or anarchism. I think what Sessions is pointing to is that deep ecology emphasizes things like ecological consciousness and individual spiritual transformation. And so it's, in a way, proposing a kind of religion or kind of spiritual transformation as the route to making the world better as far as ecology is concerned. And arguably, such an approach has some advantages over a more traditional leftist political movement like anarchism or socialism. For one thing, those leftist movements don't have an entirely pristine track record as far as the results of their actions. And for another thing, they may be a harder sell for a larger group of people. They may not be quite as convincing a political ideology or quite as convincing an ideology overall as something like spirituality, which is much more neutral as far as those policy details of what people are promoting politically. So I think you could equally as well make the argument that anarchism of Bookchin's type has a lot of advantages over any kind of spirituality, and Bookchin himself has made those arguments. But I just want to point out you could reverse that judgment too, and you could make the case that, look, there are aspects of a spiritual approach like that of deep ecology that that have some advantages over those of the more kind of traditional social movement, atheistic social movement type of Bookchin's social ecology. And the other point is that Bookchin kind of rolls Earth First, the movement, into deep ecology and treats, he has a lot of criticisms of Earth First, treating it sometimes as if it were like a part of deep ecology or it was the same kind of thing. But it seems pretty clear that even if deep ecology sometimes cites David Foreman or talks about things that Earth First is doing as a movement, they really are distinct movements. I mean, the set of principles by the Earth Firsters is different from the set of principles offered by the deep ecologists, and there's not necessarily an overlap between those two groups. So it might be a little bit unfair when Bookchin ascribes views that are clearly part of what Earth First stands for to deep ecology as well, when deep ecology may not really stand for those things.